have a question for you, a very important question around emotionally manipulative behavior that we can come across in other people. Now, I really want you to think about this, either experiences that you've had in your life, because if it's not affecting you in your life right now, it is an absolute guarantee that it will be affecting somebody who you know or love. So understanding this concept can help you help other people. But the question is, why is it that we can have interactions with certain people in life and we become hopelessly or even helplessly ensnared in their emotionally manipulative behavior? We get tangled up. And I want you to have a reflect now of times when you've experienced that in your life. It could be an ongoing process with, say, somebody at work or a family member or somebody in a friends group. Or it could be somebody that you know or love and they come home from work absolutely exhausted, dreading the next day. And it's really important to understand how and why this is happening. Now, I cover a lot about emotional manipulative behavior in a lot of my training, and I cover 6 main emotionally manipulative behaviors. And it's really important to understand this and what they look for in their targets. But I'll let you have a browse around some of the other videos. But if you're interested in a course on that, feel free to click the link in the description below. However, for this particular video, we're going to focus on module 9 of my entire course, Life Beyond the Ego's Mask, which again took me decades to understand the concept of how and why we as young people get so caught up in challenging mindsets and then give our power and authority to other people, even though we know that we are good enough, even though we know that we are skilled and capable. Sometimes we find ourselves being crushed under the weight of one person's word. It doesn't even have to be what they say. It can be a look, a sigh, and then we find ourselves chasing them around, hoping to win their approval. And we can very often have that sickening feeling underneath that we don't want to give them all that power. We don't want to think about them all the time, but we do. And why is that? Well, that's what we're going to cover in this particular module, the Peer Idolization Scale. So again, this is from my entire course, Life Beyond the Ego's Mask. So if you want access to the full course, click the link in the description below. But in this and the next video, because the module is split into 2 parts, because it's a very long module, we're going to go into how sometimes we can be taught when we're very young, unfortunately sometimes as a trauma response, to give authority to people that we might not like or respect or value or want in our lives. But then we focus on them again and again, even though that is the very last thing that we would really want to do. But the more we focus on them, the more we get trapped in that codependent loop. So with all that said, let's go into a full explanation into how all that happens, and then more importantly, what you can do about it. The content or information in these videos is for educational and informational purposes only. Now, as you'll find out as we progress, I originally called this the Parent Idolization Scale because we do idolize our parents. But I changed it to the Peer Idolization Scale because I want to broaden that perspective. Very often in life, we can hear many people say it's all about the parents or it's all the parents' fault. But that is not true at all. Anybody in our lives, in our past, that we have in essence idolized or has had a huge impact in our life could have created those videos in the subconscious mind or Pandora's box, leading to our map of the world. Now, a very powerful quote that I remember many years ago reading, and it summarizes this module perfectly. And it is, if a parent abuses a child, the child does not stop loving the parent. The child stops loving themselves. But as mentioned with this title, I've changed this to the Peer Idolization Scale. So remember, a peer is anybody that we trusted, we turned to, we in essence idolized when we were children. So I'll say that quote again. If a peer who a child idolizes abuses that child, the child does not stop loving the peer, the child stops loving themselves. And as I mentioned before, When my dad was abusive to me, I used to justify everything that he did to me. I used to justify his alcoholism and his violence and his emotionally abusive behaviour that I was an annoying child, which obviously is not true. But as I mentioned as well, and this is a sensitive area, I know, but sometimes we can justify the abuse that has been to us, because if we start to see reality as it is, as it was, and then we go into Pandora's box, there could be that terror that, what if I go into Pandora's box, get trapped in there, and it consumes my life? Okay, so as through the modules, we've been looking at some of the foundations of the mind and how it can put our world together, and then how the protector self reacts when it sees those two realities. It's also now, from this module on and further modules, to start to look at why those videos were created and why it assumed something might be pain and why it might have assumed something might be gratification, even though, as we now know, that might not be actual reality, but what we assumed is reality. Once we understand this concept, it's going to be much easier when we get to the mask and the con. Now, the Peer Idolization Scale is my own design that I created through a mix of my own research of social habits, my own personal journey, and patterns that I've observed in other people over the years. And as mentioned in module number 3, Are Things As They Appear, with all of my work, this entire program, I strongly suggest that you view this through your own filter. Never just take my word for it. I'm not saying I'm wrong, I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just offering you some information. But it's your responsibility to run this through your own filter. But before we move into the Peer Idolization Scale, I want to take a moment to reflect on 2 definitions that will be the guiding structure through the rest of this module. These are, number 1, manipulation, and number 2, influence. And just to add in here, when I mention the term influence, I'm not talking about social media influencers. This is something completely different. So firstly, number 1, manipulation. Now, the term manipulation here is going to be used for a person projecting their views or opinions onto another person for the emotional manipulator's own best interest, or they think is their own best interest, in which the other person's feelings or life situations are not taken into consideration. An example here will be if a person was anxious of their partner splitting up from them in a romantic relationship. And then they were to start saying, I love you so much, you're so important to me. Or use a form of guilt that if they leave them, they might harm themselves in some way, in the hope that that will stop their partner from leaving. So there it is a form of love bombing or guilt tripping, both of which are not considering the other person's feelings or life situation. It is all about the person getting what they want. And then secondly, we have influence. The term influence for the Peer Idolization Scale is to be used for a person projecting their views or opinions onto another person or people for the greater good of all people involved. So, as we saw with manipulation, it is a win-lose. With influence, it is always about a win-win. Now, and an example here could be, because we talked about it in a previous story of the sugar and salt, a child could be addicted to sugar and then that parent restricts that sugar to the sugar-addicted child. The child here may not like the discipline at first and may even get really upset because they're probably in withdrawal. But, as we can see, it is for the child's best interest and therefore an act of love. But just to add in there, because I want to keep your mind very open to this duality of manipulation and influence, if a parent is restricting sugar to a sugar-addicted child, that is an act of love. Or it could be a parent who wants to win the child's favour and has actually got the child addicted to the sugar. And then, if the child doesn't do what the parent wants them to do, they restrict the sugar until the child feels upset. Then when the child does what the parent wants, they give them sugar again. Thereby, it's manipulation. Which is why there is never a cookie-cutter approach to this. We have to take all of the aspects of the situation into account. Note to bear, The reason that both of these definitions, manipulation and influence, have been included is to explain, as I keep doing all the way through this program, that there is always one of two motives towards another person in regards to their actions. It is also vitally important to note that through this module and many others, there may be some explanations that may appear to be sided towards the abuse and neglectful actions towards a child. And to mention again, this is my intention through this program as somebody who has been through domestic abuse, to raise awareness of this happening. Now in life, all children will experience a full range of emotional projections from those around them. And that's why I changed the title of this module from Parent Idolization Scale to Peer Idolization Scale. Because remember, it's not just the parents. Now the healthier and loving emotions, or the emotional projections or actions from other people, will then create gratifying videos, and they get stored in the subconscious mind. The main area that we're going to be focusing on in this module is when a child is subjected to disconnecting and or painful emotional projections or behaviours of their peers. These in turn, as we now know, create emotional pain for the child, and then will be recorded as pain videos for the protector self to react to when the protector self views that on the internal cinema screen. The perception of pain. Now, as we've previously discussed, the mind is focused on survival, and it moves away from that which is perceived, remember that could be real or imagined, perceived to be painful or threatening, and then moves towards that which it perceives to be gratifying. This, as mentioned, is governed by the metaphorical protector self and that part of us which is continually observing all the situations that we encounter on a daily basis. Remember, it does this for the promotion of our health and well-being. Now, each person's protector self will only ever concern itself with the person it's looking after, and it will make decisions based on what it thinks is the best option in regards to that person's safety and emotional well-being. Now, this, as we looked at, is where it can become confusing for other people when they can observe people in life who may be taking harmful drugs that destroys their world, or they get in fights, emotional or physical, or they might keep reliving the same harmful situations, or, as I mentioned, we're going to start talking about very sensitive things, people who take their own lives through depression. And it could be confusing to think that they're going through all these situations. Surely their protector self cannot be looking out for them. However, as mentioned earlier, even in those circumstances that can be horrific, their protector self is still looking out for what it thinks is their best interests, although it may appear that nothing could be further from the truth for an outside observer. Now again to mention, I know I'm talking about very sensitive areas here, and if this starts to feel confusing, it's vital that you go back to the early modules and start to listen through again, as there's been a lot of things that I've been discussing that are the legs of the table of what we're going to talk about in Module 9. The Peer Idolization Scale. The Peer Idolization Scale, again, is my own design, of which I recommend that you run it through your own filter. And it's a metaphorical design which has been created to help define a clear understanding of how the mind may create misaligned beliefs or videos. It can very often do this, as discussed, in our younger years when we are helpless children. Now, if physical or emotional challenges were to arise to a virtually defenseless child, which pretty much all children are virtually defenseless, these videos can then be stored either in the subconscious mind or Pandora's box, and then could later amplify themselves to create a whole range of different experiences, such as low self-esteem, low confidence, shame, guilt, depression, or a whole range of anxieties. Now, within the peer idolization model, my aim is to offer a possible option, run it through your own filter. Okay, but my aim is to offer a possible option and define a potentially logical reason as to why a person may create and hold on to these limiting beliefs, which then, as we now know, in turn, continually project out potentially threatening images on the internal cinema screen, which then on top of that then create perceived threats for the protector self to defend themselves against, which then causes the protector self to hit the alarm and dump a load of stress hormones into our physical body. An important note before we begin. To emphasize the point of the Peer Idolization Scale, I'm going to be using quite amplified examples of situations that a child may face. Again, this is to get a point across, but also to raise awareness that this happens to people each and every day. This might be uncomfortable for some people to hear, but it's very important to raise awareness of this to everybody as well. Now, these amplified examples may not be relevant to everybody, and different people will have had very different experiences as they were growing up, or as we saw in Module 2, their timeline. So with this module, please take the information and again view it through your own perception and adapt it to your own personal experience. Remember, your life is your life. Nobody else will ever live your exact life. This is why it can never be compared. Now, emotional programs that can sometimes loop for many years can be learned at any age depending upon the person's emotional vulnerability at that time. Now, the reason that I've used the perspective of a child in the peer idolization model is that, again, as mentioned, we will often be at our most vulnerable when we are children. Okay, so moving on now, we're going to go through the Peer Idolization Scale. And there are 3 areas which I'm going to cover. The first area is the visual structure of the Peer Idolization Scale. And we've already briefly covered this in earlier modules, but this is our emotional scale. And then the second area that we're going to cover is the 2 areas that we as human beings can live in this scale. But as this is the Peer Idolization Scale, this is going to be more swayed to the environments that we were living in when we were children. And then the third area, which is quite a sensitive area, but is the 2 stages of when we are children, and remember how vulnerable we can be as children, and why we may associate certain actions and behaviours from other people, and then place those in those videos and then store them on a scale. Now, keep in mind at all times, our interpretation of our world is unique to us. It's not about comparing it. It's about understanding why we had that interpretation of that world at that time. And then once we have that, then we can start to understand maybe so-called irrational behaviours that we may display in life. Keep in mind at all times, why is the most important question you can ever ask. But if any of that sounds a little bit confusing at the moment, it will be fully explained as we go through these 3 areas. So the first area is the structure or the visual image of the Peer Idolization Scale. Now, to say as well, I don't know which platform you're listening to this module on, but if you want visual images of all of the models in the entire course, they are all accessible on the full course on my membership site. So to give you that visual image of the Peer Idolization Scale, it is that vertical line that we discussed earlier. So a line going from the top of a page all the way down to the bottom of the page. And at the top of the page, it's plus 10. So that is the most gratifying emotion that you can ever feel. And then all the way down at the bottom of the page, it's minus 10. And that is the most painful emotion that you could feel. Now again, keep in mind, it is our interpretation of that emotion. So there is what is really happening in real time, and then what we assume is happening. So with that visual image there, we've got plus 10 at the top, minus 10 at the bottom, and in the middle, it's 0. So from there, it's going plus 10, down the page, plus 9, plus 8, plus 7, plus 6, plus 5, plus 4, plus 3, plus 2, plus 1, 0 in the middle. And then going down is minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, minus 5, minus 6, minus 7, minus 8, minus 9, and minus 10. So with that scale, imagine it like a ladder. So +5 would be quite a gratifying emotion, but +10 would be a really intensely gratifying emotion. And then -5 can be quite painful emotion, but -10 is an extremely painful emotion. So we have these 3 main points of reference that we're going to go into now. So number 1 is 0 to +10, and that is what I call the connection section. Then we have point number 2, which is 0 in the middle of the scale, and that's totally neutral. There's no real emotion there. And then point number 3 is 0 down to -10, and this is what I call the disconnection section. And this is obviously very painful emotions. So firstly, looking at number 1, the gratification or connection section. So this is 0 up to +10. So all of the emotions or videos that are recorded in this section will be of a gratifying feeling. Now from the point of 0 in the middle of the scale, rising to the point of +10, the highest point on the scale, refers to when a person is feeling in a very secure place in their life emotionally. Now, as mentioned though, these emotions are getting more intense as they go up the scale. +10 is obviously much more gratifying than +2. Now, this is a section where a person would feel a full range of what would be classed as positive emotions. These could be creativity, joy, or love, plus obviously many others. Now this section, as mentioned, is called the connection section, and it is an environment with a feeling of trust in ourselves and of other people, or we're aware of other people if they're trying to manipulate us. Again, bringing in the contrickster. Now this section is what I mentioned as well is called the connection section. Now in a healthy way, because there's 2 sides to this, in a healthy way, the reason that we will feel in a connection section is when the mind is in a state of gratification and healthy, it will then start to move towards that which it sees as a source of gratification, i.e., for example, another person, to build a healthy relationship. Now I say healthy because obviously, as we saw, when people could be addicted to a harmful narcotic, they might think they're in a gratification section, but they actually won't be. As mentioned, not everything is as clear-cut as it seems within the mind. Now I want to keep in mind though that this scale is purely a perceptive scale. For example, if we take Joe Bloggs from moving to the big city where he was sacked after realising that 2 + 2 is not 5, he may have felt that when he walked along the road in his hometown, remember he wasn't particularly stimulated there before he moved to the big city, the emotions that he might have felt when he was at his hometown might have registered on a scale of +1. He wasn't particularly stimulated, but he definitely wasn't in pain. Now at this stage, he's very comfortable, but not elated. Whereas, after his interaction with the big city, and after he felt that overwhelming experience, he could then visit his family after that experience, to then he might walk down the road and feel a +10, because he feels emotions of connection and safety and being part of a community again. And also, to remind you again, a removal of pain can be seen as gratification. Joe, for example, could have come back from the big city feeling at a -5 and then gone to his hometown and felt total elation. Now, in a healthy way, the emotions in the connection section could be joy, feeling empowered, freedom, love, passion, enthusiasm, eagerness, happiness, positive expectation, confidence, self-belief, optimism, and creativity, to name a few. So that is the connection section and above the line. So now let's look at the second area, which is the neutral zone. So if you imagine you've got +10 at the top, -10 at the bottom, in the middle you've got that 0. Now, point 0 refers to when a person is feeling ambivalent in their experience of that moment. Ambivalence is a state of mind where a person has not really yet made an emotional decision on what something is or what that means to them. The reason for this is that they are experiencing opposing feelings or thoughts, or It could just be that they don't have enough information. At this stage, though, a person who could be experiencing a challenging situation could be at risk of the survival drive, the protector self, going either way. An example of this would be if a person is called into the office and their manager or manageress is totally flat, they are totally unemotional. So at this stage, the employee, with little to no feedback coming from their manager or manageress, it can obviously be a challenge for their mind to make a decision on how to feel or to react, or for the protector self to play any videos, because they don't have sufficient information to make a decision. So in that moment, they might feel quite confused and intensely scanning the situation for more information on what to do or what to think or how to react. Now, just to mention there as well, this is one of the tactics that the contrickster will use. Sometimes when a contrickster is trying to manipulate another person, they might not show any emotion at all, and that can sometimes trigger people's insecurity, which can then sometimes cause a flood of anxiety-based thoughts, releasing stress, and then they become more vulnerable. But looking at the third section on the Peer Idolization Scale, this is the disconnection section, as going from 0 down to -10. So the stage of 0 down to -10 is obviously the polar opposite of section 1. So section 1 is going from 0 to +10, and here we have 0 down to -10. Now it is in this section where the disconnecting emotions will start to be created in the mind. These emotions are triggered when the protector self observes a situation or a video on the internal cinema screen that is related to a pain experience. Now, the more intense or painful the experience or video association, the further down the scale it's going to be placed. So, for example, if a person was slightly scared of spiders, they might see a spider and put that at -1. But if somebody had intense arachnophobia and absolute terror of seeing a spider, that might be placed at -7. However, as we recall, it is always that person's perception, if they're not consciously aware, that will decide where they place that experience on the scale. And obviously, as mentioned, this is why different people can have different perceptions of what they see as pain. Again, going back to Module 2, we can never ever compare our experiences to anybody else, and no one can compare their experiences to ours. As mentioned, this is the disconnection section, where the mind observes discomfort and it's going to move away from that which it sees as the source of pain. Again, as an example here, if we take Joe Bloggs after going to the big city and he had his experience with getting sacked in a really intense way, he may have associated certain things to certain area of his life. So, for example, he could go to a social gathering that's not related to any kind of work-based scenario, and he might go into that room and be a little bit unsure of himself, but his protector self might only see that as a -1. But due to his very intense experience in his job role, he might then place going for a job interview at a -8 or a -9. And we saw this on a previous example in an earlier module. And we noticed that there, his protector self will be heavily involved and trying to rapidly move him away from pain. So when he went for that interview, as we remember, at ABC Company, he was totally flat because his expectation was that he was going to get rejected. Now, some emotions that could be felt here in the disconnection section could be boredom, frustration, powerlessness, disappointment, irritation, impatience, overwhelmed, anger, guilt, shame, jealousy, revenge, hatred, doubt, anxiety, and blame. And again, they are just to name a few emotions. Now, I want you to keep in mind at all times, this scale and our association to situations in our life will be in continual flux. It will change from 1 minute to the next, depending on how we associate and reassociate situations. As I mentioned in an earlier module, we could have gone on a date or had a relationship with somebody, and in the first week, we could be at +10 thinking, this person is the most amazing person ever, I'm going to get married to this person, and then a month later, we are associating that person at a -6, a -7, or a -8. Now, in essence, that person's the same person, it's just our perception of them has changed. Now, obviously, this can be with friends, or work, or our physical health, or how we see ourselves in our residual self-image. So keep in mind, this scale is constantly changing as our perception of our world changes. Now, I've got a suggestion here which I give in class, and it can be very powerful to see our perception of the world and cross-reference this with other people's perception of their world. So if you imagine you've got this scale +10 to -10, and I gave you some example emotions. So what emotion, for example, would you put at +2? What emotion would you put at +4, or +7, or +10? And then, what emotions would you put at -1? What emotions would you put at -5? What emotions would you put at -10? And then, only if this feels comfortable, when you've listed emotions on all of those 21 points, because there's 21 points on the entire scale, then have a reflect on experiences in your life that you could associate to each of those levels. So what was an experience that you could have had that was a +8? What is an experience that you could have had that was a -6? Now, one thing I'll say though is, just again, depending on what things you've experienced in life and how comfortable you feel with those, it's easier to do the memories in 0 to +10. But I would be cautious, if you have had emotional trauma in your past, of remembering memories and experiences below -7. So -7, -8, -9, -10. Because you have to respect that you have these emotions inside, and if it feels too uncomfortable for you to relate to those at the moment, then maybe just go through the rest of the program and then come back to that. Well, the second part of this exercise is, once you've done this scale for yourself, maybe go to one of your friends and ask them to do their scale, and look at the emotions that they put on their scale, and then compare them. Do you have one emotion at, say, +2? Well, they might have that same emotion at +8. Now, this obviously doesn't have to be just with friends. It can be in relationships or with work colleagues, for example. But one thing to say as well, if you are going to ask other people to do this with you, then just make sure that they are comfortable and don't feel compelled or forced to do it. So before we move on to the second area of the Peer Idolization Scale, the two sections that a child or we as people can live in, I just want to have a quick review of belief structures. So if you recall from an earlier module, there are two parts to a belief structure. Part 1 is the physical memory or the experience of the stimulus, which is recorded from the brain. And then part 2, we have the emotional association of what the brain has recorded, and that is what we will place on the scale. Now, the key here, and when some people can be confused as to how they can ever update a trauma. So I want to bring you back to a point that I referred to very early on in the program, where I mentioned it's not always what has happened to us that is the main thing to work on, but how we feel what has happened towards us. Point number 1, we've had an experience, we cannot change that. It's in the past, it has happened. We haven't got time machines, we can't go back and change history. But we can change our emotional association of what happened. But I want to bring your attention to something that's really important, and back to the self-acclaimed gurus. It's not just a simple case of remembering that trauma or phobia or overwhelming experience and then reassociating it with a happy emotion. The mind is a lot more complex than that, but there is structure and you can update those past beliefs. So if you want to stop the training now to go through that example exercise I mentioned about create your own peer idolization scale, all of the emotions at each of the 21 points, and then also memories or associations that you might have had at those points, then stop the trigger now and go through that. But again, just to add in something, if you might have overwhelming memories and it feels uncomfortable to go below -7, as in -8, -9, -10, then forget about going into that area now and then go through the rest of the program and then come back to that in your own time. Hey, hello and welcome back. So remember, this is the first part of Module 9, the Peer Idolization Scale. So you've got the second part coming, but if you're interested in gaining access to the full course, feel free to click the link in the description below. I look forward to seeing you in part 2 of Module 9, the Peer Idolization Scale.